Welcome back. All right, so in today's video, where I will look at a team that's below the playoff line and what may happen with them at the deadline, I want to look at Chicago, a team that I think tried to accelerate the rebuild in this past offseason, and it hasn't gone the way that they would have envisioned. And of course, there's been changes throughout the organization. I think that the off-ice issues this team has had have definitely overshadowed the on-ice product. The on-ice product, they're 13 points back at Calgary for that number 2 wildcard spot. They currently sit number 8 in terms of lottery position for the draft lottery. So they have a 5.6% chance of drafting first. But that first round pick goes to Columbus if it's not a top 2 pick. So if they end up drafting 4th, pick goes to Columbus. 5th, pick goes to Columbus. That trade that they made with Columbus that we can look at right now and say, well, Columbus did pretty well there, actually. It may end up being a landslide victory in favor of the Columbus Blue Jackets if it's a top pick in what's considered to be a very deep draft. So for Chicago, that's a problem, right? You don't trade your first round pick last summer unless you think that you're going to be a playoff team this year. Teams generally do not make trades where they're giving up a first-round pick and they're going to miss the playoffs. It's not generally a thing. They have this belief that they're going to be in the playoffs, so they're not worried about losing that first-round pick. Or they trade that draft pick at the draft because maybe there's a player that's available that another team wants more. There's a deal that they've made, that kind of thing, right? So for Chicago, trading out a pick that could end up being a top 10 pick in a deep draft, it's going to be tough because their power play's 19th right now. Their penalty kill's 27th. Their special teams haven't been where you'd want them to be. And their deadline cap space is only, and I'm saying only because there's other teams that have more cap space where they could park bad money, $4,222,494 according to Cap Friendly. Their top prospects, really you could put these in any order. Drew Commesso, goaltender, and could very well be a very good goaltender for them. Lucas Reichel, forward, and Nicholas Bowden, blue liner. So they don't really have a prospect coming up that you can look at and say, this is the guy who will one day replace Kane or Taves. And both players are 33 years of age. The Chicago Blackhawks need to have a strategy going forward. And I think that strategy needs to start at this deadline. But this deadline's going to be interesting. Kane and Taves are both making $10.5 million each on the cap until next year, both being 33 years of age. So for the Chicago Blackhawks, it's pretty clear that the window closed a while ago on them being a Stanley Cup contender. They haven't been in the playoffs in a bit here. They did, of course, knock out Edmonton in the 2020 bubble playoffs to make it into the first round, but they didn't last very long in those playoffs. So for Chicago, there are some questions to be answered. Now, they have some cap space for next season, right? Their UFAs, Carpenter, Lafferty, I would imagine both of them probably get moved at the deadline. If there's interest, they'll probably pick up picks there. Calvin DeHaan, be interesting to see if they move him. Gustafson, Fleury. Fleury's the big name to watch. It's going to be up to him as to whether or not he moves. And then, of course, there's the conversation of whether or not Chicago wants to bring him back next year. Fleury's numbers haven't been fantastic, but he's been much better since the slow start. And Lankinen's a UFA this summer as well. Then on the RFA side, this is where things get a little bit more expensive. Kubalik is not going to be cheap to keep around, I don't think. At least, I don't think it's going to break the bank either. I don't think they have anybody who's due for a huge raise, but it'll be interesting to see how much these guys make. Dylan Strome, who's had an up and down season for them thus far. Kirby Dach. We'll talk about Dach in a minute here. We'll go through totals and everything. Kurashev, I like Kurashev, but the point totals aren't where you'd see them if you're going to be worried about a huge raise for a free agent. And Caleb Jones is due as well. So I didn't put everybody on the board with this one because I think with Chicago it's a little bit of a different conversation than just going through the entire roster and saying, hey, so who did they sell? Because again, you've got the UFAs here. There aren't any there that get you a big return. Fleury might give them a medium return, and again, they'd have to probably retain some money on that to make it work because that $7 million cap hit, it's tough, right? That's why Vegas made him available and moved him out because that's a high cap hit, and they wanted to add somebody. So their leading scorer right now is Patrick Kane, 42 games, 11 goals, 31 assists, 42 points, to the surprise of no one. DeBrincat has had a remarkable season, 26 goals and 10 assists, 36 points in 46 games. He looks like the goal scorer he was earlier in his career. He did have one down year in there, but he is a pure goal scorer, right? Seth Jones, 42 games, 3 goals, 26 assists, 29 points. And so Seth Jones is where you're going to have the divergent arguments. There are still those who believe that he is absolutely, he can be a linchpin on the blue line. He can be fantastic. The $9.5 million cap hit until 2030, that's the kind of contract that, again, with Chicago picking up Fleury, then picking up Jones, giving him this major extension, these are moves that a team would make if they believe they're going to be a playoff team and potentially a contender going forward, right? These are the kind of moves that Taves would have wanted to see. Keep in mind that when Chicago looked at maybe doing a rebuild, Taves came out and said, we're not interested in doing a rebuild. So this is the problem, is that you'll never see a play. At least I can't think of a player saying, "Oh, this is great. I can't wait to go through a rebuild." But teams do need to go through them, and I think for Chicago, they're in this position. It reminds me of Vancouver, where they do need to do a rebuild of some sort. You can call it a retool, like what the Rangers did, but they never really fully committed to it. So they kind of halfway did. And then they bring in Seth Jones, give him that money. They bring in Marc-Andre Fleury, and with the idea that, hey, we think we can get into a position where we're competitive. And so it's kind of a mixed message that's out there. Then you have Hagel, 12 goals, 12 assists, 24 points in 40 games. He only makes $1.5 million until 2024. I say only because in comparison to other guys who I think have had poorer seasons than Hagel, he's a bargain. Brandon Hagel, he's the guy who I would think teams would call and see if he's available because you have term and you have a really good contract, and Chicago would likely say no. Hagel, you could make an argument on some nights and maybe in some weeks of Chicago's games, he's their best player. Then you've got Taves, 43 games, 4 goals, 15 assists, 19 points. He is not the same Jonathan Taves he was before. And so he's coming back from a whole year off, and yes, that's tough. And it's especially tough for him because he's older, too. And so this is that whole discussion of, older players and all of that wonderful stuff, right? So with Taves, the question becomes one of, and I asked this question, 3 years ago, I think in a video I asked it, about whether or not Chicago, for cap flexibility, with that $10.5 million cap hit, if they would have been better off. And it was a question I asked years ago. They didn't do it. It doesn't matter. But whether or not it might have been better for them to move Taves if they're not going to be a playoff team and get that extra cap space, find some way to get that flexibility. At this stage, Taves will play out the rest of his contract in Chicago, and that $10.5 million cap hit, we'll see what happens this coming summer. Do they sit down with one another? Do they discuss an extension? Does Kane sit down with Taves? Do they decide jointly that they're going to stick around? Maybe they sign for less money. Because again, that $10.5 million, that's $21 million your cap space to Kane and Taves. And I can't make an argument against Kane being worth $10.5 million. Not honestly. But Taves, at this point, is he a $10.5 million player? Probably not, no. So, while I do hope to see Taves return to his prior form, at this point we have 19 points in 43 games, and it definitely looks like he's on the back nine of his career at this stage. Then you get to Dylan Strome. There were rumors about him being available before the season started. Is he available now for trade? 33 games, 7 goals, 11 assists, 18 points. A very up and down season for him. And so we'll see whether or not they move him at the deadline if there's more interest. Because there were rumors he was on the trade block before the season started, and then early in the season, and nothing came of it. Kubalik, 46 games, 10 goals, 7 assists, 17 points. I think he's been better than his point totals. Kirby Dach, 43 games, 6 goals, 9 assists, 15 points. As recently as 2 years ago, Dach was one of my favorite members of the Hawks. I thought Kirby Dach was going to be a star. And it just, I don't know what's happened this year. I don't know if there's a nagging injury or if it's just a really big down year for him. But it's been alarming. He's invisible in some games too. So it's not as much with some players, they'll talk about how they're getting opportunities and they're not getting the goals, like a Donskoy in Seattle. So they're still playing well, they're just not getting the results. With Doc, yeah, there's plenty of games where I'll be watching the game and thinking, is Doc in the game? And then I'll hear his name and I'll be like, okay, so he's he's on the third line, or is he on the fourth line? What's going on with... So Doc, I have questions with him. What's interesting with Doc is he is a restricted free agent this summer. So I think one of the key questions for whoever ends up being the GM in Chicago to answer is, how much is Doc worth and for how long? And what do you do with the player to try to get him back to where he was a couple of years ago, where he looked like he was at very least going to be a very effective top six forward and pretty good at both ends of the ice. Then you've got Gustafsson, 40 games, 2 goals, 12 assists, 14 points. Him being a UFA this coming summer, I would expect him to be moved at the deadline. Kurashev, 40 games, 3 goals, 9 assists, 12 points. And so while he's an RFA and I think he's a useful player, he won't get a huge raise with the 12 points there. And you have Stillman, 28 games, 1 goal, 9 assists, 10 points for him. Entwistle, who I think has some upside there, 30 games, 4 goals, 5 assists, 9 points. Connor Murphy, been a rough year for him, 43 games, 4 goals, 4 assists, 8 points. He makes $4.4 million until 2026. Borgstrom, 32 games, 4 goals, 3 assists, 7 points. They would probably want more from Borgstrom than what they've had so far too. McCabe, 40 games, 3 goals, 4 assists, 7 points for him. He makes $4 million till 2025. So you have Jones, Murphy, and McCabe are taking up, about $18 million in your cap space. And so again, if that ends up being an effective trio on that blue line, it's worth it. But if we continue to see a team that's outside the playoffs, the defensive numbers aren't where you'd want them to be. Because a penalty kill this 27th, there's 3 culprits. You could A, have a goaltender who's having a rough year. B, you could have a defense core that just isn't able to make that penalty kill work. Or you could have a special teams coach that's just, in maybe in need of replacement. So whichever it is for Chicago, that's something they'll need to figure out likely in the offseason. The new GM's going to have a lot of work to do here. There's a lot of cleaning up. And again, it depends on the new guy that comes in and whether he says, you know what, we've got $22 million in cap space this summer. We'll re-sign guys we can. We'll see what we got left over, and then we'll try to gear up and go for more. Or says, you know what, we're going to have to rip the Band-Aid off here and we're going to have to figure it out. Because remember, the last time this team threatened to go into some kind of a rebuild, Taves was like, we have no interest in a rebuild. So does that then mean that Taves would this summer say, yeah, I'm not really looking forward to a long-term extension because I want a chance to win one more Stanley Cup? And then do discussions start there about what's going to happen with Taves. Their goaltending, Fleury 14, 16, and 3 with a .908 save percentage. That .908 save percentage is pretty high considering where he started and considering how bad things looked at the start of the year. Lankinen 2, 5, and 4 with an .889 save percentage. I don't think that tells you how decently Lankinen's played either. I think Lankinen's been good for the most part. Soderblom, just the 0-1 record, .881 save percentage. I thought he looked all right. Delia 0-1 with a .750 save percentage. He's a UFA this summer too. I didn't actually throw that on the board because I don't think there's going to be a big market with Delia at this point, and so we'll see what they do. Because for goaltenders, I think Soderblom's the only one with a contract for next year right now. And of course, Comesso, young goaltender, you don't want to necessarily throw him into this situation at this point. So there are some question marks with Chicago and how they approach this. And really the key thing at the top of this is, will the new GM still look at this team and say, we've got Kane, we've got Seth Jones, we've got Taves, we've got Fleury-Net. You know what? We've got enough here that we could probably put something together and maybe make a run at a playoff spot next year. Or does he step in and say, we've got some older guys on this roster, we've got some holes on this roster, we need more draft picks, so we're going to have to go through a retool/rebuild. And at the very least, the GM's going to have to sit down, I would think, with Kane and Taves and explain, here's our situation, here's where we're at, and here's what we're going to do. Sometimes I think that's what players are looking for, is just at least a seat at the table to know what the plan is. That when things are just going sideways and GMs are making moves, they don't really know necessarily what's going on. I don't think it's always, because then you can get into the conversation about whether or not players have too much control. I don't think that's what it always is. I think sometimes it's just they want to know what's going on. and they don't like really big surprises like everybody being traded and suddenly there's a rebuild going on. If there's going to be a teardown, I would think that it's got to be done right, and I don't know that Chicago has done that. And again, it really reminds me of Vancouver. It's very to me it's similar. Bringing in big contracts, trading out prospects and draft picks with the idea of we're going to try to get into the playoffs, and it will cost them in the long term. I've liked Adam Boqvist in Columbus. Like I wanted to say Carolina, it's not Carolina, it's Columbus, as an example. I know Boqvist didn't have a great year in Chicago last year, but I think he's been decent in Columbus. And again, that $9.5 million to Seth Jones, we'll see how that contract goes for them. It kicks in next year. That's why it lasts till 2030. So it's a nice long contract. And how that all pans out, how he pans out, could go a long way to deciding how this goes with Chicago and maybe how long the rebuild's going to be. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.